Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Health Show here only on the Islam channel with me, Alistair Greener. Every week, as you know, we're joined by a health expert within their field of expertise who discusses preventions of health issues that we or our loved ones might face. So we're going to look at how you can change your health and lifestyle for the better, offering an alternative viewpoint from our health experts to help guide you in the right direction. Now, if you'd like any further information on our programme or the topics we're discussing, then please do email us at healthshow@islamchannel.tv and let us know your thoughts. Now, today we're looking at counselling for those who suffer with HIV or have other sexual health concerns. According to a recent report by Public Health England, an estimated 101,200 people are living with HIV in the UK. Of those, 13,500, that's 13%, are unaware of their infection and are at risk of passing the virus on to others. In 2015, 88,769 people received HIV care in the UK. That's up 73% from a decade ago. And now more people than ever are coming forward because of prevention programmes. Now, we appreciate this is a very sensitive, but it is also an important topic, and we really want to be able to help anyone watching and make sure that they are aware that they have a place to go for support and help, as well as medical advice. Now, we're delighted today that counselling expert Kaiser Khan from NAZ has joined us today. NAZ, or NAZ, is a sexual health charity dedicated to helping people who can experience better sexual health. We'll be discussing a range of sexual health services and programmes that are available, specifically for men and women from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic, that's BAME, communities. Guys, it's lovely for you to come along. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. And just before we talk with you a little bit more, we're going to have a look a little bit more at a video. But let me tell you a bit more about Kaiser Khan, because he is the coordinator for the NAZ Muslim and faith testing group, and he also heads up a support group that helps over 100 Muslims living with HIV. He has over 20 years experience within the HIV sector supporting families, not to mention being a trained rapid HIV tester. Now, just before, as I said, we talk to him more, let's take a look at how South Africa launched a major clinical trial of an experimental vaccine against the AIDS virus, which scientists hope could help save millions of lives.
Did you know that?
Our main target is young girls and young boys, adolescents, before they reach their sexual debut. And we would like to look at a school-based program. And so one of the things we will be doing at the same time as we execute this trial is start to investigate the immunogenicity of this vaccine in other age groups.
South Africa bears the brunt of the HIV epidemic. We have the highest burden of HIV in our country. Yes, we have taken strides, but we are not there. And that is why today we are just so proud to be launching this HVTN 702 vaccine trial, because it provides the dawn of a new era. If this vaccine is found to be safe and efficacious, it could help prevent millions of lives of South Africans that are currently being lost. These vaccines have been bioengineered in the lab. They are not actual HIV. They are not pieces of HIV. They are not weakened parts of HIV. But they have been bioengineered or made in the lab to look similar to HIV. So when these vaccines are given to potential participants, hopefully they will induce an immune response which would be able to provide protection against HIV.
I've already started educating others and I've already brought others here. And so I understand that it's a long process to do, but 36 months is nothing. That's it.
Kaiser, it was great to see the video there, and how positive to see that there are some ideas of vaccines and things out there, and obviously there in South Africa. Let's go back to the very beginning in terms of, maybe helping people who don't really know an awful lot about AIDS. First of all, tell us what HIV is, what AIDS is, what's the difference, so that we can understand it more.
Okay, so HIV is a human immunovirus, which is basically something you would have like a normal virus within the body. And you can contract that through the HIV virus itself, which will remain dormant for some time within the body until it replicates itself. When it replicates itself, the virus then grows within the body. The higher the virus gets, then you acquire symptoms. So number of syndromes you will acquire, which will then become an acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So that's a syndrome, that's a deficiency syndrome. So you will have a number of multiple issues that will happen. It will affect yourself to acquire the AIDS deficiency. Today, hopefully, we don't actually see that many AIDS-defined deficiencies, but HIV still remains dominant.
So again, AIDS is a progression from the HIV virus. And how long has this virus been around?
Well, it's been around since the early 1990s, probably earlier than that, but it came into light a lot sooner than that. And there was very little known about it at the time. It was just known as a gay disease at the time, and it was predominantly affecting the gay community until they realised that this wasn't the case.
Well, it's interesting because I'm of a certain age that I remember some very powerful advertising and public awareness films that were around, around the sort of early 90s. And it really was just a very hard-hitting to give people the indication of how dangerous this virus is. I mean, is it still as dangerous as it was?
Oh, absolutely not. No, it's far from it today. The era where that we got those really strong advertisements saying, hey, RIP, rest in peace, you're going to be gone within a couple of months of contracting the virus, that's far gone. We now in such a progression of HIV and treatment of it that it's actually now seen as a long-term illness rather than a death sentence.
Okay, so let's get to some basics and maybe a little bit of an opportunity to do some myth busting, if you like. First of all, how do you get AIDS, or how do you get HIV? Let's talk about the early stage. Right. So how could you possibly contract it?
Well, HIV has to be contracted through a route, so it has to be a route of transmission. So the route of transmission has to be something of, it has to be fluid, it has to be breast milk, it has to be injected through, so it is basically through fluid, and it has to get a route to get inside the body. And the main route to get inside the body is through breast milk, through blood, or through semen.
And so in terms of, because I know there's sometimes fear of people when they're around people with HIV, whether they can contract it. So, for example, can it be passed through saliva?
No, absolutely not.
So it's basically, as you said, through breast milk, semen, or blood. And both have to get, one or other of those have to be in contact with each other.
You'd have to have a good contact. You have a good quantity of contact. So it was called quality, quantity, and quantity. So depending on what it was and where it was, you could have a small cut and you could be HIV positive. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to pass that virus on to somebody. If you haven't got the quantity there, you haven't got the quality there, that transformation of route isn't going to be there. So normal precaution would be, that you would have to take precaution no matter what you do. That's the standard, no matter all health professionals have to take precautions. But if you're not a health professional and you're out there and you don't know about somebody's status, and you suddenly find out that they're HIV positive, rather than preventing to treat them, it's very easy to treat somebody, knowing the fact that you're not going to come into the quantity or the quality.
So the reality is it's actually very difficult to contract unless there's sexual activity, or I think you mentioned also if you have a blood transfusion.
Yeah, or you have a good quality or quantity where you can get the blood transfused inside of you.
And again, the blood transfusion, I know in the UK, all samples are now tested, I believe, aren't they?
Screened, yes.
So you can't get through a blood transfusion in the UK, but other countries in the world where that's still a risk?
It's still a risk. Under the World Health Organization, most countries now screen their bloods. But obviously in some third world countries, blood isn't screened rapidly, but especially where there's an emergency blood transfusion needed, it's not screened straight away. And there are risks of people still contracting it through blood transfusion.
Now, I've also heard that when you suspect that you might have contracted HIV because you have come into contact in the quantities you've been talking talking about of either blood, semen or breast milk, that you can go to a doctor straight away, and there's things that they can do straight away if you suspect you have come into contact.
Absolutely. If you feel you have come into contact with the virus at any stage, then we would say you go to the emergency clinic, which is your A&D clinic, and you would be given the PEP treatment straight away.
So the good thing is there's a lot of positive things. I really wanted to, and I know that we're talking about counselling, but it's really important to establish some of the basics that some people might not actually know. And again, AIDS is only the advancement of the HIV virus. Yeah. It's not an independent.
It's not. It's only an advancement if treatment has not worked. If the first-line treatment, second-line treatment has not worked, and you still carry on obtaining opportunistic infections after infections, then you develop AIDS. And even then, when you do develop AIDS, you can still recover from the infection rates.
Now, the other thing you mentioned earlier on is that it was known initially, or it was somehow had this label of being the gay disease because it was thought that it was only transmitted between homosexual men or things. I mean, that has obviously, people have broadened their horizons a little bit, but I guess there's still some people who still use that label.
They do still use that label. I mean, there was a huge, I can remember back when it was first advertised, it came from the US where a large population of gay men had been diagnosed with HIV, and instantaneously that became, it's a HIV gay disease, and they didn't look at it as a worldwide epidemic. It was seen as an epidemic within the USA, within Europe, within UK. And I think that still remains in people's thoughts and behaviour today. And that stigmatised a lot of communities, thinking that if I have got it, people are going to automatically presume, I have been promiscuous or I've been gay in some respect. And that's how I caught the virus.
Let's talk a bit about stigma, because within the BAME community, stigma is massive. It varies obviously from one community to another. What I found really interesting on your website is that you are very broad-reaching in the people that you will actually help. Why is the stigma about HIV, sexual health, why is it more of an issue within the BAME community? I
think within the BMA community, there's a massive correlation that we don't have sex outside of marriage. It's sinful to actually do anything outside of the marriage. It's not seen as normal to have relationships, before marriage. So that's why it remains a stigma, huge stigma. People automatically presume it as a sexual disease. And if it's a sexual disease, it's an automatic assumption that you've been promiscuous, or you are promiscuous, or you are having unprotected sex out there. And that then obviously has a whole effect on who you are as a person in the community, your respectfulness as a person, individual, and what will people think of you. And it then becomes a stigma in terms of culture, race, and it becomes a whole huge issue in regards to religion as well. And what would your religious aspect be looked at?
Well, let's investigate that more, especially within the Muslim community. Are there any things that are specific, specific concerns for the Muslim community surrounding this topic?
Well, again, I think it's back to the topic of, whichever culture you come from, it's about, is it acquired through sex? And am I going to be seen as a sexual promiscuous person? And in Islam, as we know, sex outside of marriage is sinful. So is that sin, the word sin, that actually connotates into the whole issue about HIV? Am I a sinful person? Will I be seen as a sinful person? What will my neighbours think of me? Will I be ostracised? Will I be discriminated against? Am I going to be talked about? Am I going to be the laughingstock of the community? So that's what actually sticks in people's minds when it comes to HIV as a whole.
And of course, what we hear stories many times of where maybe someone has brought the disease to the marriage, or maybe someone's been unfaithful within the marriage, but so often people who are definitely not the individuals that you're talking about who still become affected.
Yeah, exactly. There's a large population of people who have actually been infected by their partners who have brought it into the marriage. But then again, that still remains that even though they're brought into the marriage, that's not something they're going to advertise saying, my partner's been promiscuous and he's brought the disease upon me. It's them carrying it individually. So then it's them that carries the burden individually as well. Then think, this is my issue now, this is my burden, and this reflects me only. It doesn't reflect anybody else around me.
And given the stigmas that you've been talking about, of course, counselling is even more important for BAME communities than maybe other people, because they feel they need specific support. Tell us a little bit about Naz, who you are and how you help? That's a big question, I know.
Oh, it is, yeah. So if I can remember far back. Naz started in 1990. So we're going back quite a long time, and it started with a young man called Nazir. So the acronym Naz is from his full name, Nazir. Nazir was he was the first Asian gay man to be contracted with HIV, who then developed AIDS. And from that, he then realized he was ostracized by his community, by his mosque, by his family, and then there was a founder, a gay activist and a HIV founder, Shashvinda Khan, who then took on the role to see how he could advocate for people's rights, cultural rights, religious rights, freedom rights, in terms of looking at how many people within the Asian population are going to go through this. And within that, NAS was founded.
And it's obviously something which is very personal for you in terms of, working within the BAME community. Are there concerns that you find, because I know it's not just the BAME community that you'll see, obviously, anybody, but is there anything that you specifically notice trends within the BAME community of people coming for counselling?
Reluctancy. There's a real reluctancy to come for counselling. It's not the norm within the BME community to think counselling as a normal psychological thing. I think BME community find it hard to actually sit down and talk about their issues, to talk about their problems to one another. It's not the norm to sit down with somebody in a room with nobody there and then kind of spill your guts out and think, oh, this is what my issues are. It takes a lot of time and effort to be able to engage with somebody, to be able to gain their trust. I think the BME issue have a trust issue as well. They don't trust people very easily, and they're very kind of enclosed. People who don't tend to come out a lot, don't tend to talk to people a lot. So there's a division between cross-culture and Western culture.
So how do you give confidence to people who come to you to say, listen, don't worry, nothing outside of this room is discussed, we're here purely to help? How do you convince people that that's your approach?
Well, counselling and testing is a continuum of looking at people's needs and making sure there's a safety mechanism in place for them to get the right type of help and the proper type of help in terms of their safety in the long term. So it's about looking at and explaining to them that, one, we can provide you the cultural appropriate counselling, we can provide the linguistic appropriate counselling, we can provide you a very safe and enclosed counselling environment. We're not based in a hospital, we're not based in an environment where you're going to see a lot of people, or you're going to encourage, or you're going to come across a lot of people who might recognise you. We are kind of excluded away from society in that respect. So people then do have a little bit more confidence thinking, yeah, I can trust NAS and I can actually go to NAS and I know they can hold the confidentiality, or they have the cultural norm to understand where I come from as an individual.
That's a big issue, isn't it? Understanding the culture. And obviously an organisation like NAS is going to be great, and especially thinking about Muslim women, knowing that they can go to a female counsellor, and a female counsellor who will understand their particular concerns and understand the community that they've come from.
Absolutely, yes. In the past, we've had women counsellors who have come in who have been fully hijabbed and niqabbed as well. So that's not the norm to see in society today, is to have women who come into a Western background and in a Western society to come into counselling and often wear their full veil, an Islamic veil, and then offer counselling even to men and women and not be shy from it. So I think that's given a real encouragement in terms of our project, in terms of the counselling project, is to be able to say, look, we are open. We can have a very clear, open dialogue with you about your issues, about your things, and offer you a very enclosed, safe space to be able to do that within.
So just before we go to break, describe to me the sort of typical circumstances where somebody might come to you, because we've talked obviously a lot about HIV and AIDS, but I know you look after people with any form of sexual health concern. So first of all, how do people tend to find out about you, and what's that first session, that first meeting look like? What normally happens?
Well, for me, the first meeting is when someone's referred to me through my clinic. or from another health organization or from another charity organization. So my first meeting is with an individual just to have a normal conversation of one-to-one, not to say we're going to talk about counselling, just to get a better understanding, do an assessment of their needs and see where they're coming from as an individual. Then offer them the guidance and thinking, right, this is what the service offers and this is where you can get the right type of service and this is what if these are your issues, these are your concerns, this is how we can help, break down those barriers and concerns with you. And then it's about going through the assessment period, going through the assessment process and then saying, right, which service would best suit you and how can we best advise you on those particular services.
So you don't really have to have any preconceptions before you come to NAS. No. If you just have any concerns whatsoever, go and see someone and they will point you in the right direction.
In the right direction of the service, that's right.
How long do people normally come for? First of all, how long is a session and how many sessions would they have?
Well, in counselling, we often have 12 sessions, and we give them 12 sessions to start with. Not to say that those 12 sessions will end. It all depends on individual counsel and what the complexity of the case is and what they're carrying with them. That can be continued on the basis of the counselling supervisor, who will then obviously have a look and see whether that can be offered on a long-term basis or not. We don't have an open-ended thing. What we do have is an open-ended support service or an open-ended one-to-one service, which can continue for years. They don't have to go into what's called the guidelines of 12 sessions. They can talk to me on...
So they know that they've got ongoing support
after that, yeah. So we can have one-to-one for years to come, if possible, until they've addressed what they need to address.
And I'm guessing that people's circumstances will change during the counselling. Maybe somebody's contracted HIV, maybe they've got another health concern with their with anything to do with any sexual health concern. What sort of development is there within the programme to help them?
Development are basically looking at how it's about encouraging people to become independent and have the independency to be able to go out and do things for themselves. So we encourage people to actually seek the right type of services which will give them our empowerment to be able to be self-sufficient. Employment, access to services, access to training, access to maybe the right type of hospital care and treatment that they actually do need as well. So we do often that. We often see people coming in saying, I don't think that the clinic that I'm going to is offering me the right type of service or support. And the good thing is, with HIV, you don't have to be specific to one clinic. You can actually go on to any clinic.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to talk a lot more about this after the break, but it's been really fascinating, at least getting a background of how everything works. Now, we should stress that should you suffer from any medical problems, it's always highly recommended that you contact your doctor or GP, as the Health Show gives you an alternative viewpoint to the health concern being discussed. Now, it is time for a short break now, but please don't go away, as we'll be discussing more with our expert straight after the break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Health Show, where our topic today is sexual health and counselling for people with HIV. So far, we've talked to Kaiser about the work the charity NAS does and the types of services they provide for people suffering with HIV. But before we delve more into patient stories and the help that can be offered, let's take a look at a short video clip where leaders in the fight against HIV recently urged the US government to maintain funding for AIDS research as they welcomed the news of a 9-year-old girl beating the AIDS virus into long-term remission after receiving a drug cocktail in infancy.
I want to get one person from the US and one.
The White House earlier this year recommended a $242 million cut in PEPFAR funding for the remainder of fiscal year 2017, which represented a 6% percentage budget cut for PEPFAR. This seemingly modest cut would have had devastating effects downstream, including 253,000 adults and 50,000 children experiencing HIV treatment interruptions, and resulting in as many as 40,000.
We will not end AIDS in children by 2020, which everybody has endorsed. And there are a number of other things that we won't be able to do, and we'll see setbacks if we don't have high levels of investment continue.
Impacts the care of people with HIV.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because you get this challenge all the time over funding versus what can be afforded, and then the care. And are a lot of the charities like you providing all of this care without any funding from anywhere?
Funding is a huge problem, and it's not something that comes readily, especially now HIV it's become dominant into the what's called the long-term health conditioning. The government's looking at the fact that it's not needed to actually help promote HIV as it used to, where hundreds of pounds were being spent on it, millions of pounds were being spent on it. We're finding now that we're having to really reach out and look at where the epidemic of the HIV is stranding from. So majority of our funding comes from not the government, it comes from mainstream providers, it comes from corporate organisations who want to use the money for looking at health initiative in the communities and how we can help, combat health inequalities, how we can help combat, diseases, etc.
We talked in the first half a lot about the counselling that NAS does and how you help people. Do you have such a thing as a typical individual who comes to you for help?
Typical individuals that come to us for help are people who are struggling with their day-to-day living, day-to-day taking of medication, day-to-day coping with their daily life, not being able to have relationships. Those are the kind of typical people that we would see on a regular basis, people who are really struggling to actually live with the virus and then blame the virus on a number of issues that are going on wrong with their lives. So they'd have housing issues, their personal issues, their financial issues, their relationship issues. Those are all the kind of typical issues that they have, but that's always an issue that's actually come back to their HIV, and because of their HIV, they feel that those are the other things they can't deal with.
And as we saw in the clip there, HIV isn't just an adult disease, it's a virus that affects children, as we heard the 9-year-old there. Do you have children who come to you, and if they do they have to come with their families, with their parents, or how does that sort of thing work?
Children would always have to be accompanied with a parent. We don't see children individually.
And what age would that be up to?
They can be from birth to right up to the age of 18 when they're going to transitioning. So at the time when they transition into adulthood, they will remain with us as children, and they'd have to be accompanied with parents.
So do you often then get families? I know certainly in the African subcontinent where you typically find a whole family who have been affected by this. Is that something that will happen with you, where people come together as a family for help about how to deal with the situation?
We don't readily see family as a whole. We may see a family with one individual or two individuals, but not readily as a whole. I think most families don't tell their children about their diagnosis, and that's the hard part. It's how do we tell, when to actually disclose your status to a child. Many parents find it very difficult to disclose their status to their children. So when children are taking medication, they don't know what they're taking the medication for. They find it quite difficult to think, why am I having to take this medication, Mum? What is it for? And parents often say, oh, it's to keep you healthy, it's a vitamin. It's just to make sure that you're staying safe. So we have to have this dialogue, and this is where the counselling services continues. There's a continuum of always the services coming on, that when is the right time to tell your child, because eventually they would have to disclose, because the child would have to go into adulthood, and when they're going into adulthood and transitioning to adulthood, then they have to take responsibility for their own sexual behaviour. And the parents can no longer then be involved. So we do need to get them ready to do that.
And we're going to talk about prevention in just a few moments, but just continuing the theme of a child, because some people might be watching thinking, hang on a second, how does a child contract HIV when clearly they're not sexually active? So how are they contracting it? And I'm guessing the circumstances are surrounding the mothers. What is a typical scenario in Britain today for that?
I mean, the typical scenario around children contracting vertical transmission is through birth, and that's very rarely done in the UK today, because everybody is screened at pregnancy for HIV. It's a normal screening, and everybody gets asked, we're going to do a HIV screening on you. If we know somebody is reluctant to have that screening and doesn't want that screening, then the alarm bell starts ringing, thinking, well, this person has to be positive, and then we need to look at the safeguarding issues about why this particular individual doesn't want to take an HIV test. Other issues are breastfeeding, and there's a whole issue around when people live in communities and they live within the large community and they're not breastfeeding, it's often asked, well, why aren't you not breastfeeding your child? What's the reason behind it? So we do find that some people from Sub-Saharan Africa or Asian communities do then think, I need to breastfeed my child. And today, the good thing is a woman who is remain undetectable can breastfeed. So there is that possibility of doing that, but they'd have to be tested on a routine basis to make sure the viral load is not increased.
I know some people will be watching thinking, hang on, in Britain, is this the sort of thing that's happening within our community? Are we finding children with HIV? Is this something that you have seen in your counselling sessions?
We do see children on counselling sessions, yes, but they would come with parents.
And it will be because it's been passed through. The
yeah. And usually when someone's disclosed their status and when children have then been disclosed, it's working with children. And then we often refer them to an adolescent psychologist who will then work with young children about how to cope with and what's the understanding of your diagnosis as a young child.
Let's talk a little bit about prevention, because obviously some people will be watching this and especially if they're beginning their journey in relationships and beginning a sexual relationship, might be a little bit concerned that, hang on a second, how can I be sure that I'm not going to catch it? It's not something that comes up on a first date, for example. What sort of advice do you give to people in that situation in terms of, do they go and get tested? What kind of conversation should they have with a future partner?
I think it's very difficult, and this conversation comes up time and time again. Do I disclose? It's all about disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. When's the right time to disclose to somebody? There never is a right time. That's the thing. People often fear, if I disclose, am I going to be ridiculed? Am I going to be, discriminated against? Am I going to be stigmatized? Am I going to be beaten? Is there going to be violence involved in this? What's going to happen? So there is never a right time. So we often say that you have to try to look at the fact is, HIV transmission and then criminalization is very, very common, and it can happen if there's reckless transmission involved. So we need to give clear guidelines and guidance around when is the right time to tell somebody to take a test prior to sex. Because
especially looking at the Muslim community, prior to marriage, that there's the conversation and how that conversation is broached. Do you give advice on that?
We do, yes. Sex was openly talked about during Islam when it first preached, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, peace be upon him, used to talk about sex to his audiences, and people used to come to him. I remember in a hadith where somebody came and said to the Prophet, what do I do when I have to ejaculate? And they talked about how to make something out of a cloth to protect themselves from the semen. And we do try to encourage this conversation with our clients, especially the Muslim clients, though it is a very difficult conversation to have and to broach. It is had, and it's easily had with men rather than women.
And I think one of the things that people may not realise is, yes, we want people to be very aware of this terrible condition, but at the same time, we don't want to frighten people too much. It is actually quite straightforward to prevent any form of contraction.
It is, yes. We look at people who are serodiscordant. So you've got a positive partner and a non-positive partner, and we look at the fact that how can you form a relationship and what's the best way of protection. Obviously, using a condom is your best form of protection. We often say practice safe sex at all times. But then that also comes into the factor of, well, if I practice safe sex, am I going to have a child? What's going to happen? And if I'm not going to disclose, and why am I practicing safe sex with somebody? So all these questions are often running through people's minds, and it's often something that's on the table that we have to discuss with people.
One of the things that I know that you are qualified in, you're a rapid HIV tester. Tell us a little bit about that. What does that mean?
So we do the 4th generation test, which is rapid HIV. So what we do, we take it's like doing a diabetes blood test. We take a small sample, we prick somebody on the finger with a small sample, we use a small little pot that we put the blood into, and we put the reactor into it, and it tells us whether that person's antigens and antibodies are actually positive or not at the time. So if we get a reactive test from something, then we know that that person has got HIV. Then we'd have to send them off for serology tests.
And the other thing that you do as well is you have your faith group as well that you lead. Tell us a little bit about that and the work that you do with, I believe, over 100 members.
Okay, Muslims in the City started back in 2010. And when we were actually looking at how many Muslim people were coming through the doors and how many needs there was of the Muslim community, majority of Muslim communities wanted to meet partners and wanted to meet individuals who they could associate and then think, oh, I need to get married. But how do you get married when you're positive? Will I ever have a child? Will I ever get married? Will I ever be able to have a relationship? So it was based on the idea of let's see how many people we can get together and how can we encourage Muslim people to actually not fear anymore that this living with the virus is not something they need to be fearful for. It's to break the barriers around stigma and discrimination. So we formed Muslims in the city around the barriers to break the barriers of stigma and discrimination in Muslim communities.
In terms of where we are at the moment, we've talked a lot about the journey of the HIV and AIDS from the early 90s right the way through today. Where are we at the moment and where are we going with this? There seems to be a lot of positivity around, but also a lot of work has still to be done.
We've come a long way and we've seen a massive reduction in HIV, but unfortunately within the BME communities, that still remains, a challenge. And it remains a challenge because we're finding it more and more difficult for BME communities to come forward and get tested. So if you look at statistics will show that in compared to a normal Y generation person, the rise in HIV within the BME community is much more higher today. So,
Why do you think that is?
I think that's because people are reluctant to test and reluctant to understand what HIV is all about. One, it's difficult. We started the Testing Faith program in 2012 when the BBC aired a program about one of the churches saying it was perfectly okay not to take your medication, have your trust in God. And we thought that is totally not the way forward. So we needed to educate people, thinking, no, that's not what religion teaches you, and this is not what health teaches you as well. From an Islamic perspective, we thought, no, we definitely need to tell people you've got to conform to your medication. Islam clearly says, clearly take your medication, but you've also got to remain in your faith as well at the same time and trust in your faith. So it was formed around that part where we thought it's interesting to see how we can speak to faith leaders who can take the lead within their congregation to talk about HIV prevention.
I was going to say, there's a big crossover for Muslims between their faith, going to the mosque, talking to friends and family, talking maybe if they're enlightened to counsellors such as yourself. What's the sort of standpoint from imams about HIV and getting support and help?
We've had a good response. I mean, the problem we have with imams is trying to break through the gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers are usually the mosque chairmen, etc. And unfortunately, in today's society, that's still run by relatively older generation people. So once we break through the gate barriers, we can speak to the imam, and the imams are quite forward-thinking and quite, open-minded in terms of looking at how we can talk about sexual health openly with the congregation about HIV, especially about prevention of HIV. What can we do in terms of prevention, and what is prevention of HIV within their communities?
I was going to say, in terms of the prevention, is that something that imams are discussing in terms of avoiding the whole issue in the first place of contracting HIV?
Well, it's the typical imam will turn around and say abstinence, 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 and that's the same in most religion. They will say stay abstinent, and that's perfectly fine. That's the way of prevention. That's their method of prevention. We have to then educate them and say, no, that's not the only prevention method of HIV. We have to look at the factors. It's about making sure you have safer sex. If you are going to have sex, how do you prevent yourself from contracting HIV? And it's about testing earlier. The sooner you test, the better it is. As soon as you can get tested, the better you are in your chances of getting a good result from contracting AIDS.
And I presume there are going to be people with a lot of different theories and thoughts behind all this, and yours is one opinion that I suppose some people might disagree with.
Absolutely, yeah, there's a lot of disagreement to this, and I'm sure people will have a lot of disagreement that we shouldn't be discussing. Sex should not be discussed in the faith community. Sex is illegal, and it's wrong, and it's sinful, and why are we discussing in a mosque? But the reality is, when we're seeing an increase of BME communities being affected with HIV, then we have a duty to say, okay, how do we protect our communities from HIV?
It must be very difficult, to wanting to observe your faith absolutely, but at the same time introducing a certain level of pragmatism.
Absolutely, you're quite right. It's a fine balance, and it's about how do you find that fine balance, and it's a difficult balance. You've got to have a really good dialogue and a massive dialogue with your community faith leaders. You've got to get their trust in you first of all. Once we've got their trust, then we know that we can deliver a robust program.
One of the things people watching might be thinking is, you know, am I the odd one out here? Am I particularly unusual in my circumstance? Give me some indication of how many Muslim individuals come to you who are maybe individuals or as couples, just so that people realise that they're not alone.
Okay. I just ran a Muslim group last month. Now, last month we got 20 attendees come to the group. And for one group for an hour, 20 attendees is a pretty good outcome. So when we can get that number of people coming, getting support from one another, and that's called peer support, then I think we're doing a job well done.
And can people come direct to you? Because you said at the beginning of the programme how very often you're recommended through, you know, medical experts and different agencies and so on. You know, can people come direct to you, or is it purely through referral?
People come directly through us. I get lots of referral through emails. I get a lot of conversation from people from abroad, so people from India, Pakistan, from Canada, from all over the country would email me wanting information about what do I do, brother, about this issue? How do I go around talking about sex to my partner now that I'm positive? Will I ever get married again? Can I have children again? So I get a number of emails, you know, concerns saying, what do I do now, brother? How do I do this?
And what would you say to someone who isn't necessarily they're not affected themselves directly, but they might know someone, a loved one maybe, or someone that they suspect, and they want to somehow broach the subject, but in a sensitive way to say, hey, listen, there is help out there for people in our community?
Education is key, and I think it's about if they know what HIV is, if they've been educated and understanding what HIV is and how you can and cannot contract it, they can give that reassurance to the individual saying, look, I fully empathise and understand where you're coming from, and I'm here to embrace you and to help you along your journey. And I think it's very important for an individual to understand that they are going to embrace and welcome the individual back into their life and say, look, I'm not going to be the person who's going to walk away from you just because now I understand what you're going through.
I think the fact that you're prepared to broach a subject probably says that, doesn't it?
Exactly.
But when they come to you, who would they see? What's the makeup of the people at NAS? Who are you all?
Well, we're a number of people. We have 4 services. So we have the HIV support services, we have prevention services, and then we have the research services. So it breaks up of a number of groups that we have. So we run the Muslim group, we run the Latino group, the Portuguese group, and the Black African groups. From there, we will try to see, we'll navigate which person needs to go to which group, which individual, and who needs to see which expert from what their needs are. And there's a robust assessment that's done for each individual. We'll have a look at what their assessment needs are first, why they're coming to NAS and what the reason to come to NAS is for. And then they get navigated through the system in terms of where they will refer to and what's the best service that's going to actually give them the result or the outcome that they require.
Our main message throughout this show has been about just get some help if you're concerned at all. What other key advice would you give to someone who is concerned about any aspect of their sexual health, and specifically talking to our Muslim audience?
I would say if you have any concerns, don't be afraid to pick up that phone and talk to an expert. Right, you know, whether it be somebody, your GP, whether it be a hospital, or whether it be a charity like ourselves, pick up the phone, talk to somebody, and you can be reassured that you will get the right guidance and advice in terms of what to do next.
And again, some reassurance for women particularly, and the level of confidentiality, which I know is always an issue for the Muslim community.
Confidential is a key aspect of our work, and we always make sure that every single client's, status is respected and it's confidential, and we maintain very confidential in everything that we do. So clients can be rest assured that when they come through the door to NAS, that we do not disclose, even though if we need to pass on information, they've got to give us consent. Without their consent, we will never pass on information unless it's a safeguarding issue.
And finally, just looking at the whole issue of counselling, Give us an indication, maybe I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, but maybe a very brief success story of someone who came to, whose life maybe has been turned around in terms of their confidence and who they are.
Okay, a typical scenario. We had somebody who came to us and had counselling for a good number of sessions. From those number of sessions, was able to finally take up the courage and tell their parents that I'm positive and I'm living with HIV.
Wow.
And that individual was embraced by their parents. Their parents did not shun them, but they were actually grateful for the fact they actually came into counselling, they came into the services. We were able to talk about these things. We were able to guide them. When's the best time to discuss this? How's the best time to discuss this? First of all, we have to make sure that we can overcome the person's fears and barriers first, their anxieties. Once we can overcome the anxieties, they can do the rest of the work for themselves.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot of confidence and helped us an awful lot. And unfortunately, we are towards the end of the show. So there you have it, some important but really, really helpful advice on HIV counselling, as well as prevention and support programmes. I hope today's topic was informative. And please, please, if you or anyone you know suffers from or has any sexual concerns, then please do reach out. Never leave it undiagnosed. You can get in touch with NAS directly in the strictest of confidence, as you've heard, by emailing them at simply naz@naz.org.uk. Couldn't be easier. I'd like to thank Kaiser Khan. Thank you so much indeed for coming into the show and giving us a better understanding of this sensitive but very important issue, and also maybe getting rid of some of those myths as well. If you would like to find out more about this subject or any of our subjects at the show, please do get in touch. healthshow@islamchannel.tv. And once again, we must stress that should you suffer from any medical problems, it's always advisable and highly recommended that you contact your doctor or GP, as the Health Show gives you an alternative viewpoint to the health concern being discussed. But for now, it's goodbye from me and see you again soon. Assalamu alaikum.